All right, so if you're a new gamer, you've got one big problem. There are way too many great games to know where to start. So today, we're cutting through the noise with 23 games that are genuinely worth your time. Different genres, different experiences, but one thing in common. These are the games that show you why people love gaming so much. So let's get started.
All right, here we go.
Let's start with number 1 on our list, and it's God of War Ragnarok. If you're new to gaming and want to understand why big budget single player games get people this excited, this is almost a perfect starting point. What makes Ragnarok special isn't simply that everything looks ridiculously expensive. It's how well all those pieces work together. The combat has weight without becoming complicated, and there's enough variety in weapons, abilities, enemies, and encounters that you're rarely just doing the same thing for hours. But honestly, the character work is where the game really separates itself. Kratos, Atreus, Freya, and the rest of the cast actually feel like people dealing with consequences, not just characters waiting for the next boss fight. And for a newcomer, the huge number of accessibility and difficulty options also means you can shape the experience around yourself. Now, number 2 is Clair Obscur Expedition 33, and this is the one I'd recommend to anyone who thinks turn-based RPGs are basically watching menus do the fighting for you. Expedition 33 takes that old formula and injects actual tension into it. You're still choosing attacks and planning your turns, but when an enemy swings at you, you're not completely helpless. You can dodge, parry, counter, aim directly at weak points, and actually feel responsible when a battle goes your way. That makes even ordinary encounters surprisingly engaging. The other big reason this game hits so hard is its presentation. It has this strange, beautiful, almost dreamlike European fantasy identity that you don't confuse with another RPG 5 minutes later. And then there's the writing, music, and characters, which give the whole thing an emotional weight that sneaks up on you. It's ambitious without feeling like it needs 50 filler systems just to look big.
Careful, Mael.
At number 3, we have Ghost of Tsushima. And honestly, this is one of those games where the first few hours already tell you exactly why people love it. The sword combat is ridiculously satisfying because it's simple enough to understand, but demanding enough that you actually start paying attention to what enemies are doing. Different stances give fights some real rhythm, while parries, dodges, and those dramatic standoffs make even random encounters feel cinematic. But the bigger achievement is the way Tsushima handles exploration. Instead of covering your screen with 27 icons saying, "Look over here," the game uses wind, animals, landmarks, and the environment itself to pull you around the island. You can start the evening planning to complete one objective and somehow end up following a fox halfway across the map. That sense of discovery, combined with the gorgeous landscapes and surprisingly strong character stories, makes Tsushima feel less like a checklist and more like an adventure. Number 4 is 007 First Light. And this one is especially interesting because it finally feels like someone understood what makes James Bond fun in the first place. IO Interactive didn't just turn Bond into another third-person shooter. The game gives you opportunities to sneak around, manipulate situations, use gadgets, fight when things go wrong, and generally behave like a spy who occasionally gets dragged into absolute chaos. That Hitman DNA is obvious, but First Light isn't simply Hitman with a Bond skin. The missions are much more cinematic, the action is bigger, and the whole thing has that ridiculous, this would be expensive to film energy. It also helps that the younger Bond gives the character room to actually grow instead of starting as the perfectly polished super spy we already know. And when the game gets its mix of stealth, gadgets, hand-to-hand combat, and blockbuster set pieces right, it really does feel like you're playing through a Bond movie.
Go left here.
And at number 5, we have Hollow Knight Silksong. After all those years of waiting, the funny part is that the game actually had to prove it was worth the ridiculous amount of hype surrounding it. And somehow, it did. Silksong takes the exploration and mysterious atmosphere that made Hollow Knight special and builds an even more elaborate world around Hornet. Movement feels faster and more agile, which completely changes the rhythm of exploration and combat. You're constantly discovering strange areas, enemies, shortcuts, and secrets, and the game has that wonderful Metroidvania habit of making you think, wait, what was that thing I couldn't reach earlier? The difficulty can absolutely humble you, especially if you walk into certain fights thinking you've suddenly become a gaming god. But that's part of the appeal. The world is beautiful, the animation is remarkably expressive, the soundtrack adds enormous atmosphere, and there's always another mystery sitting just beyond the screen. Let's continue with number 6, and it's Resident Evil 4 Remake. This is one of those games where the pacing deserves almost as much credit as the combat. You're constantly being given something new to deal with, so the game rarely falls into that, okay, I've been doing this for 3 hours problem. 1 minute, you're carefully searching a dark room for resources, and the next, you've got half the village trying to turn Leon into a human punching bag. The remake also makes combat feel incredibly physical. Enemies are aggressive, Leon moves with weight, and the new parry system gives you another way to survive when everything goes completely sideways. What really makes it special, though, is how cleanly everything connects. Exploration, puzzles, shooting, stealth, upgrades, and set pieces. Nothing feels like it was added just because the developers needed another feature. At number 7, we have Astro Bot, and this game is basically proof that you don't need a giant open world, 200-hour campaign, or depressing-looking protagonist to make something incredible. It just focuses on making every level fun, and somehow Team Asobi keeps coming up with new ideas without making the controls complicated. You'll learn a new ability, think, okay, that's pretty cool, and then the next level completely changes how you use it. The platforming is extremely polished. The levels are packed with little surprises, and even collecting things never feels like boring cleanup. Then there's the DualSense, which is probably the best example of that controller actually adding something meaningful to gameplay. You can feel different surfaces, actions, and environmental effects through your hands. It's playful, creative, and ridiculously polished. Basically, the gaming equivalent of opening a box of toys and immediately forgetting you have responsibilities. Number 8 is The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, and this is where you realize why people still talk about a game that came out more than a decade ago. The biggest achievement here isn't simply the size of the map, it's what you can actually find inside it. The side quests are so well written that calling them side quests almost feels disrespectful. You'll occasionally start one expecting 5 minutes of monster hunting and end up involved in a complicated story with characters you actually care about. Even better, your decisions can come back later in ways you genuinely didn't expect. The world also feels like it has its own problems rather than existing purely for Geralt's entertainment. Villages have consequences, wars affect people, and the landscape itself tells stories. Yes, some of the mechanics show their age, but the writing, atmosphere, and quest design remain ridiculously hard to beat. This is one of those games where I'll just do one more quest is basically a dangerous lie. Now we're at number 9 with Bloodborne, and this is probably the game on the list that can make a new gamer question their life choices. But there's a reason people still obsess over it. Bloodborne doesn't simply make combat difficult, it makes combat feel aggressive and personal. You're encouraged to stay close, attack quickly, and take risks, instead of standing 10 feet away waiting for an opening. The trick weapons are a huge part of that magic because they aren't just different weapons. They completely change how you approach a fight. A weapon can transform mid-combo, giving you different ranges and attack patterns without constantly sending you into menus. Then there's the atmosphere. Yharnam feels like somewhere you absolutely should not be walking around at 3 in the morning, yet somehow you keep pushing deeper because you need to know what's around the next corner. It's mysterious, hostile, and incredibly stylish, and every victory feels earned. And at number 10, we have Hi-Fi Rush, which might be the easiest game on this list to describe as pure fun. Everything has rhythm. The combat, the animations, the environments, even little background details are constantly moving with the music. But don't make the mistake of thinking this is just a rhythm game with some punching attached. The combat is genuinely deep, with combos, dodges, parries, special attacks, and assists that let you experiment with different ways of handling enemies. And the brilliant part is that you don't have to be a human metronome to enjoy it. The game rewards playing on the beat, but you can still fight effectively if your timing isn't perfect. Then the art style comes in and completely sells the personality. It feels like someone turned a Saturday morning cartoon into a character action game and somehow got away with it. It's stylish, funny, energetic, and most importantly, completely committed to its own weird idea. Let's move on to number 11, and it's The Last of Us Part 1. If you're new to gaming, this is one of those experiences that can completely change what you expect from a game's story. What makes it so effective is that it doesn't constantly scream, "Look how emotional this scene is." It gives the characters room to breathe, and then lets the situation do the damage. The gameplay helps too. Resources are limited enough that you're always making little decisions about whether to sneak past someone, take the risk of fighting, or save that precious health kit for later. And the remake makes the world feel far more alive, with improved enemy AI, environmental detail, and facial animation. But the real magic is the pacing. Quiet exploration, tense encounters, and character moments constantly trade places, so the journey never feels like a string of disconnected levels. At number 12, we have A Plague Tale: Requiem, and this is the kind of game that becomes more impressive the longer you stick with it. It isn't trying to be the greatest stealth game ever made, and honestly, that's not where its strength lies. Its real power comes from the combination of atmosphere, character relationships, and sheer spectacle. The rat sequences can go from "this is disgusting" to "okay, this is actually terrifying" in about 3 seconds. And as the game progresses, Amicia gets more tools, giving you more ways to deal with enemies instead of always crawling through grass and hoping nobody notices you. The world also knows when to slow down. Some of the quieter sections let you simply exist with these characters, explore beautiful environments, and forget about the next disaster for a minute. Then, naturally, the game remembers that it hates you. Number 13 is It Takes Two. And if you have a friend, sibling, partner, or anyone willing to tolerate your terrible gaming decisions, this one is almost impossible not to recommend. The genius is that cooperation isn't just something the game allows. Practically everything is designed around it. One minute you're solving a puzzle together, the next you're platforming, racing, fighting a boss, or playing some completely ridiculous minigame. And the game keeps changing the rules before you have time to get bored. Just when you think you understand the current mechanic, another one appears. That variety is what makes the experience so memorable. You're constantly talking to the person beside you because the game keeps giving you reasons to communicate. You press that. No, you press that. Why did you do that? And somehow, 5 minutes later, you're both laughing. It's one of those rare games where the person sitting next to you becomes part of the experience. Now we're at number 14 with Elden Ring, and this is probably the game on the list that teaches you the most important lesson about modern gaming. Sometimes the best objective is having absolutely no idea what you're doing. Elden Ring gives you an enormous world and basically says, go. There's no need to follow one perfect route, and if something destroys you, you can simply turn around and find something else. That freedom completely changes how difficulty feels. Instead of hitting the same wall for 3 hours, you can explore, discover better equipment, level up, learn new abilities, and eventually come back ready to settle the argument. And the world is filled with those moments where curiosity actually pays off. You see a strange structure in the distance and start walking toward it, with no idea whether you're about to find treasure, a secret area, or something that can kill you in approximately half a second. That unpredictability is a huge part of why it works. And at number 15, we have Silent Hill 2 Remake. This is a perfect example of how you can modernize a classic without sanding away everything that made it uncomfortable in the first place. The remake looks dramatically better, but the real achievement is the atmosphere. The fog, sound design, oppressive environments, and strange little details constantly make you feel like something is wrong, even when absolutely nothing is happening. And that might be the scariest part. The game understands that your imagination can do some of the work for free. The combat has also been rebuilt for modern third-person controls, making encounters more direct and intense, while the new presentation gives the characters more emotional weight. But the biggest reason this game stands out is that the horror isn't just about monsters jumping out at you. The story itself is unsettling, and the town feels like it's slowly forcing you to confront things you'd probably rather avoid. Next, 16th game on our list is Journey. This is one of those games that proves you don't need a 100-hour campaign, complicated skill trees, or a character who explains every 5 seconds what you're supposed to be doing. Journey is incredibly simple on the surface, but somehow manages to leave a bigger impression than games 10 times its size. You're mostly moving through this beautiful desert, discovering things at your own pace, and gradually figuring out what this strange world is about. The music does a ridiculous amount of emotional heavy lifting, while the art direction makes practically every frame look like it belongs on a poster. And then there's the multiplayer twist. You can encounter another player, but communication is limited to simple sounds. No usernames, no voice chat, no awkward, "bro, where are you" moments. Just two strangers quietly helping each other. It's short, mysterious, and surprisingly unforgettable. At number 17, we have Black Myth Wukong. And if you want something that immediately makes you feel like you've stepped into a massive fantasy adventure, this delivers. The obvious attraction is the spectacle. The environments look fantastic, the creature designs are wild, and the boss fights can get genuinely ridiculous in the best possible way. But what makes Wukong more than a pretty tech demo is how satisfying the combat becomes once its systems start opening up. Dodging, spells, transformations, and different abilities give you plenty to experiment with, while the game generally keeps the action moving instead of burying you under endless menus. It also takes a more focused approach to exploration than a giant open world, which I actually think helps. You're encouraged to look around, find hidden paths, and discover optional encounters rather than simply following a GPS arrow. And when you finally beat one of those monsters that has been bullying you for 20 minutes, yeah, that feels good. Number 18 is Horizon Forbidden West, and this is a great example of an open world sequel understanding that bigger only matters when there's actually something worth doing. Yes, the map is huge. Yes, there are machines everywhere. Yes, the game will eventually give you approximately 17 different things to upgrade and make you wonder which menu you were even looking for. But underneath all that is a surprisingly strong adventure. The machine combat is still the star because you're not simply emptying a health bar. You're looking for specific components, exploiting elemental weaknesses, tearing armor off, and figuring out which part of a giant mechanical animal you should absolutely not stand in front of. The side quests deserve attention too. A lot of them actually revolve around characters with their own problems, instead of existing purely to send you to a random location and collect 12 robot ears. And visually, it's still one of those games where stopping to admire the scenery feels completely justified. Now we're at 19th game on this list with Sifu, and this is the game where I'd give a new gamer one small warning. Don't expect to be amazing immediately. Sifu is built around the idea that getting beaten up is basically part of the curriculum. Its combat is incredibly precise, and once it clicks, there's something almost addictive about entering a room, getting destroyed, figuring out what went wrong, and coming back noticeably better. The aging system makes that learning process even more interesting. Every death pushes your character closer to old age, so mistakes actually have consequences beyond simply reloading a checkpoint. And eventually, you start recognizing enemy patterns and controlling fights instead of desperately reacting to everything. That transformation is the real reward. You go from wildly swinging at people to calmly parrying attacks and throwing somebody into a table like you've been doing kung fu for 20 years. It can be punishing, absolutely, but when Sifu clicks, few action games feel this satisfying. And at number 20, we have Alan Wake 2, which is probably the strangest game on this list. And I mean that as a compliment. Remedy basically decided that a survival horror game should also feel like a bizarre television series, a detective story, a psychological thriller, and occasionally a live-action movie. And somehow, all of those pieces fit together. The atmosphere is ridiculous. Dark forests, abandoned buildings, strange sounds, flickering lights, even when nothing is attacking you. The game has this constant feeling that reality has gone slightly off the rails. The story is where it really gets ambitious though. It constantly plays with fiction, memory, and reality. And just when you think you understand what's happening, the game happily throws another curveball at you. Combat is more deliberate than traditional action games, making light an important part of dealing with enemies rather than simply unloading bullets into everything. It's weird, stylish, occasionally hilarious, and genuinely committed to being different. 21st game on my list is one of my all-time favorite, Control. This is the game you play when you want something that feels completely different from everything else on the list. The best thing about Control is how quickly the combat goes from, okay, this is a cool third-person shooter to, wait, I'm throwing an entire office at somebody. Telekinesis is ridiculously satisfying because the environment basically becomes your ammunition. Grab a desk, launch it at an enemy, shoot them, dash across the room, and suddenly you're flying around like you have absolutely no respect for workplace safety. But the combat works because the setting supports it. The oldest house is constantly shifting between sterile government offices and genuinely bizarre supernatural spaces, making exploration almost as interesting as the fights. The story intentionally keeps some answers just out of reach, which only makes the whole place more intriguing. At number 22, we have Red Dead Redemption 2. And this is the game that teaches you that sometimes slowing down is actually the best way to experience a video game. Rockstar could have filled the map with constant explosions and activities, but instead, so much of RDR2's magic comes from simply existing in its world. You ride somewhere and stumble across a stranger. You stop for a drink and somehow end up involved in an argument. You're hunting, get distracted by something in the distance, and 20 minutes later, you've completely forgotten what you originally planned to do. That level of detail is what makes the world feel believable rather than simply enormous. And then there's Arthur Morgan, whose character develops naturally through the things he says, does, and experiences. The game isn't afraid to take its time, and that patience pays off massively. By the end, you understand why people still talk about this one like they're remembering an actual place they visited.
Watch those balconies!
And my final recommendation for all of my gamer friends is Uncharted 4: A Thief's End. If you're a new gamer and want to experience what a polished blockbuster game can actually do, this is basically a masterclass. The important thing is that the huge action sequences never completely overshadow the characters. 1 minute you're involved in an absurd car chase, climbing through collapsing ruins or swinging across a gap. And then the game suddenly slows down and lets Nathan, Elena, Sam, or Sully simply talk. Those quieter moments are a big reason the spectacular ones work so well. The gameplay also flows naturally between shooting, climbing, puzzles, driving, and exploration, so it rarely feels like you're being dragged from one disconnected activity to another. And Naughty Dog absolutely nailed the cinematic presentation, without turning it into a movie where you occasionally press a button. The set pieces are spectacular, but the emotional side is what gives the whole adventure its lasting impact. And that's the list. If you're a new gamer, these 23 games should give you a pretty good idea of just how crazy good gaming can get. From massive adventures to smaller, unforgettable experiences, there's something here for almost everyone. So pick one, give it a shot, and trust me, you're going to have a hard time putting the controller down. Let me know which game you're starting with, and I'll see you in the next one.